I think we should also be focusing on the emotional dimensions of becoming a new parent or becoming a parent for the second or third time, but just that critical period when your child is so vulnerable to tone of voice, to a parental attention, a sense of being loved, because those are the years when a child learns to trust others and a child learns to regulate their own emotions, and experiences intimacy, which is going to be important right through their lives.
Welcome to Season 15 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand that the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Thanks so much for watching. Enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I am joined by Dr. Simon Baron-Cohen, who is a professor of developmental psychopathology in the departments of experimental psychology and psychiatry at the University of Cambridge. He's also the director of the university's Autism Research Center, which he founded in 1997, and a fellow of Trinity College and the British Academy. He's the author of 3 popular science books about empathy: Mind Blindness, which focused on how we understand others, aka cognitive empathy; The Essential Difference, which explored our emotional reactions to others, the aka affective empathy, which we will get into; and 0 Degrees of Empathy, which in North America is entitled The Science of Evil, which unpacks the origins of cruelty and uncovers the social and biological determinants of empathy. Simon has published over 750 peer-reviewed scientific articles which have made contributions to autism research, typical cognitive sex differences, and synesthesia. I get that right? Synesthesia research?
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, welcome to the show, Simon.
Thank you, Anita. I'm looking forward to our conversation, and thank you for inviting me.
Wonderful. It's wonderful to have you folks who are listening and are watching. I just went through like 10 minutes of tech glitch, feeling all freaked out, and Simon was nothing but gracious and empathic as he was waiting patiently for me to sort that out. So practicing what he preaches, I appreciate that. I'd like to begin because you are a bona fide expert in the subject. Some people come at empathy from a lot of different perspectives and are self-taught. You have done a really deep dive over decades in this topic. And I guess I'd like to know whether or not you'd be willing to share a little of your personal route to this moment, or what drew you to empathy research in the first place on a personal level.
Okay. I can think about how to approach this, but empathy could either be studied like academically, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. That these days you can use all the tools of cognitive neuroscience to really dissect what is empathy. But you can also look at it, as you're inviting me to do, in a more personal way, and also in a more societal way. Like what is the role that empathy plays? I would argue as the glue that creates social cohesion and helps to reduce conflict. And for me, it's all of those things. I have a kind of scientific curiosity, driven in part by trying to understand people with a diagnosis of different kinds. I've devoted my academic career to studying autistic people, and they struggle with one aspect of empathy. We'll talk about that. But they're not the only group who have a diagnosis who struggle with empathy. And in my book, 0 Degrees of Empathy, I explore how there are, other in other diagnostic groups, for example, people with what was called borderline personality disorder, or people with antisocial personality disorder, might also struggle with different aspects of empathy. But these are all very sort of clinical and academic reasons. I think mostly it's just a realization that if we all do whatever we can to nurture empathy, either in our friendships, in our family relationships, in our neighborhood, the world can just be a better place. And it's that kind of realization that I suppose it makes it more than just academically important. You can see that there's a real role that empathy can play in making the world a better place. And you only have to switch on the television or open any newspaper to see the result of what happens when people lose their empathy, whether we're talking about the conflicts around the world that are happening at the moment, Israel, Palestine, Russia, Ukraine, and in many other parts of the world. Or, just in terms of the tragedies of family breakdown, when you have two individuals in a family who've stopped talking to each other because they think that they're right and the other one is wrong, and they can't see the other person's perspective, and there's no way to kind of resolve this because they're taking a single perspective instead of a double perspective. So maybe we'll sort of explore some of these ideas.
Well, so what I'm hearing and what I appreciate is, obviously, as a researcher who has published as much as you have, you care deeply about the science of empathy, but also it seems to be a thorough thread that you care deeply about the implications of the absence of empathy in the world and in people's lives and what it could mean if we bolster our innate capacity to empathy and what that can mean for our relationships and the way we treat each other in the world. So in that regard, we are very simpatico. I still remember my dad when I was telling him that I was going to do a PhD and I was going to make empathy my focus. He said, "How are you going to get a job studying empathy?" But I really respect that.
I mean, in the wider world, sometimes people don't use the word empathy, but they use the word compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about it, there are plenty of jobs that require compassion. We can think of any of the helping professions like social work or nursing or counselors doing therapy and so forth, where you need the ability and the drive to be interested in another person's thoughts and feelings, and to care about them in the sense of having the appropriate emotional response to what the other person is telling you. So I think your dad was wrong in this, I'm sure he's a lovely guy, but in the sense that there are plenty of jobs for people who have that talent at empathizing with others. And, the world needs more people like that.
And extending that further, research into leadership and the importance of an empathic leadership style is becoming ever more obvious.
Yeah, no, I would agree. We can look across the globe at leaders who show very little empathy and those who show a lot, and the consequences of those different leadership styles. So at the moment, I would say that never having met Putin, his now very prolonged attack on the Ukraine suggests an absence of empathy for that population, for that group of people. And the borders are arbitrary, people are people. Whereas if we took leaders like Mandela, who's quite often cited, where even from his position in prison, he was trying to imagine, what does the majority population, the white population, what do they think and feel? And his counterpart, de Klerk, was also thinking about the black population. What do they think and what do they feel? And how can we bridge these two very different perspectives? That leadership style led to the end of apartheid. So you're right, even at kind of national and international kind of global politics level, if our political leaders use empathy in their politics, that can change the world.
Now, I know you're a believer in the bell curve of empathy, that, more or less all of us are situated somewhere in that middle ground.
Yeah.
Some are highly empathic and some lack empathy. I wonder if you could speak to two issues at the same time. One is that there's a difference between affective empathy and
Yeah.
cognitive empathy, and why that difference is important and how that relates to the bell curve.
Yeah. I'm going to take it in the reverse order.
Okay.
So starting off with the concept of an empathy bell curve, because what I tried to propose in several of my books, The Essential Difference in 2003, and then 0 Degrees of Empathy was an extension in 2011, was this idea that empathy is not all or none. You don't either have it or lack it, but there are degrees of empathy. Just like any other trait, if we think of physical traits like height, it's not like you either have height or don't have it, but you have degrees of height. And the same would be true for any other skill, like musical ability or athletic ability. Empathy is just a psychological characteristic where you can have more or less of it. And when you measure it in the population, what you see, what scientists call the distribution or the shape, is a bell curve, like an inverted bell. And statistically, most of us are just average, and that's fine. Maybe there's, you don't need a lot, and it helps if you don't have too little. But if you just have an average amount, the world will tick over pretty well. But then, like any distribution, any bell curve, you see people at the extremes, and we could talk about people who have a lot of empathy, so they're above average, but also people who have very little. And the book, 0 Degrees of Empathy, explores the social and the biological reasons why you might end up at the low end of that spectrum. We'll come on to those things maybe, but then you were asking about like the empathy bell curve is where you kind of add all the different parts of empathy together and look at your total score. And we developed a measure called the empathy quotient, which just gives you a total score. And it goes from 0 to 80. So it just gives you an idea of the variation in the population. But within empathy, you know this better than anyone, there are different types of empathy. So cognitive empathy is, I call it the recognition part, that when I'm looking at you, I'm trying to recognize or imagine what you're thinking and feeling. And I might be doing that on the basis of reading your facial expression, your body language, using context. You may have told me some background information, reading between the lines, all kinds of available information, but just to recognize or make an inference about what you're thinking or feeling. So that's cognitive empathy. But the other part is affective empathy, which is having figured out what you might be thinking or feeling. And it's always just a best guess because our thoughts and feelings are private. What does that trigger in me emotionally? Do I have an appropriate emotional response? So that's the response element. The affective part is the response element. And the reason these things matter is that again, going back to different clinical groups, you find some clinical groups struggle with one. Autistic people, for example, struggle with the cognitive part. They might look at facial expressions or listen to tone of voice and be confused by it. But other groups struggle with the other part of empathy, the affective part. And people with antisocial personality disorder are a good example. They can recognize someone else's state of mind, but they don't have the appropriate emotional response. They just don't care how someone else is thinking or feeling. So they know that you're in pain, but the reason they can go on and hurt their victim is they don't care about the fact that they're in pain. So you end up, and for me as a clinical psychologist, you end up seeing, in this case, autistic people and psychopaths or antisocial personality disorder almost as mirror opposites because they struggle with different parts of empathy. And it's not the case that one group lacks empathy, because autistic people have, it turns out, intact affective empathy. If you tell an autistic person that you're, for example, sad or in pain or distressed, they care about it and they want to help you. Whereas, psychopaths or people with antisocial personality disorder, they have excellent cognitive empathy. That's how they're able to deceive another person, manipulate another person, know exactly what is going to hurt another person. But the fact that they can victimize in that way suggests that their empathy, if you like, is dissociating in terms of below average affective empathy.
Is there, I find it interesting since you also have expertise about autism. Are you discovering, or is there promise about practices and ways in which people who are on the spectrum or have autism can overcome that cognitive empathy gap?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we've explored different approaches. For example, we've tried to teach emotion recognition or the cognitive empathy part by showing autistic people videos of actors portraying facial expressions and just helping them almost learn the language of emotional expression. And the same goes for vocal intonation. So if you're kind of imagine that, you're in a culture where you don't speak the language, then for many of us, instead of just intuitively trying to crack the code, we would go for language lessons and we would maybe have an interpreter, but you have to kind of learn the language. And what we're finding is that autistic people, given the opportunity to learn to recognize facial expressions or vocal expressions of emotion or mental states, they can improve. And there are probably lots of other ways that you can intervene to help autistic people improve in their cognitive empathy. I've met some people, for example, who learn cognitive empathy by reading novels, because in novels, the author writes, this character thinks or this character feels, and then spells out what the person is thinking or feeling. So in a novel, you don't need to sort of guess what the person is thinking or feeling. The author tells you. And that can give them like a foothold into this otherwise confusing world of people's thoughts and feelings. So, there might be many imaginative ways using drama and other ways, to encounter perspective taking, maybe even just getting social feedback where others tell the autistic person, I felt this was rude or I felt this was insulting, even if the person didn't mean to be rude or insulting. Just giving that kind of feedback can help the autistic person to learn, okay, this is what I must seem like to another person.
So then also on the side of the bell curve where there's low or limited capacity for empathy, we've got the narcissists and the psychopaths. I wonder, from a psychiatric perspective, are there ways to overcome that deficit as well, or are they lost causes?
I wouldn't say anyone is a lost cause, and maybe that just reflects the optimist in me. But you hear of really imaginative projects going on in prisons and in secure hospitals where people have done terrible things, including murder or sexual violence, but where the perpetrator is brought face to face with their victim in order to understand the victim's perspective and the victim's feelings. And those groups, are reported to be very powerful. Those, if you like, encounters. And they wouldn't be being conducted if people didn't believe that even someone who's done some terrible things, and that is true for some people with antisocial personality disorder, violent crimes, couldn't learn some empathy, including affective empathy, And I've certainly, through a charity in the UK, it's called the Forgiveness Project, I've met people who've been through this, but this is anecdotal. The families of victims who've met the murderer, for example, who killed their daughter, because not just because they don't want to live with hate towards somebody, but also they realize that the perpetrator often has his or her own backstory, and they want to give that person a chance to be treated as a human being,
Mhm.
and humanizing people who've done bad things allows that person to grow and to find their way back into society.
Yeah, that sounds like very important work.
Yeah, but I think maybe we need, this is the scientist in me, we need evidence that such imaginative approaches, they're worth it, because they're working, people are changing. So
Mm,
I never give up on the idea that people can change.
mm.
Otherwise, what's the point of having clinical services, or the education system, or we need to believe that people are capable of change.
So two more questions about this bell curve. One is the other side. So I've often described the flip side of the bell curve are the folks that are known as empaths, right? The highly sensitive people. They feel flooded by other people's emotions. They have hard time being in big rooms of people without sort of taking on the feelings of others. I don't know if you define that side the same way, but what is important for them to learn in terms of how to navigate the world so that they aren't overwhelmed or saturated by empathy?
Hmm. Yeah, and it is very interesting why the majority of the population statistically end up in the average range. Maybe there are some downsides to having too much empathy. You're talking about in terms of feeling overwhelmed, because if you're responding emotionally to everyone else's pain, and the world is full of painful stories, it can become overwhelming. And you might need to shut down. Some people have wondered if it could even lead to depression.
Mm.
Um, so obviously everyone has to find their own balance in terms of what they can cope with. Um, and, to the extent that empathy, like many other traits, might be partly biological and partly even genetic, it's a controversial thing to say. It may be that natural selection has ended up with the majority of people just having average levels for a reason. Too little has its downside, too much has its downside. So there may be a kind of optimal kind of middle point, a bit like a dial that could be, turned up or down. Um, but on the other hand, people who are lucky enough to have high levels of empathy could really put it to good use. So they've got to look after themselves in the whole process, but at the same time, they become very valuable people in any community in terms of helping others, um, and just kind of almost, modeling what it is to show compassion. Um, so I would say that when it comes to the research, we know a lot more about people who struggle with empathy, maybe because they come into contact with clinical services. We know less about people at the other extreme. And it may not surprise you, since I'm an academic, that I'm calling for more research in terms of evaluating the methods that we have, like that forgiveness project, or studying people at the other extreme.
Beautiful. I'm going to read a sentence from the acknowledgements of your book, which reads, "In this book, I attempt to redefine evil in terms of empathy and look at why some people have more or less empathy than others and what happens when we lose it."
Mm.
So I want to dig into why that, sort of you've already mentioned there's the social, biological, epidemic, what is it?
Epidemiology, yeah.
Yes, there's that too, which can
Yeah,
either, increase or reduce our capacity for empathy. Um,
right.
But before we do that, I maybe could ask, because it's been on my mind for a while, having studied the absence of empathy and how cruelty can manifest and why it does, how
Yeah,
have you as a person who's
yeah,
looked into some really dark corners of human behavior across
yeah,
time, some of the
yeah,
most egregious
yeah,
examples, how do you think about your own life
yeah,
differently?
yeah. I mean, it's interesting because when people ask me about my book, Zero Degrees of Empathy, or as you said in the States, North America, it goes under the title The Science of Evil. Yeah. I sort of wonder why people would even buy it because it's not the kind of book you want to read just before bedtime. You know, it does contain a lot of examples of people who do horrific things. But part of my motivation for writing the book was to try to understand why or how are human beings capable of hurting one another. The flip side, of course, is, you know, why and how are human beings capable of kindness? So not just cruelty. But it does, you know, it was depressing and upsetting for me to write and to write some of these stories. And so I can only imagine for a reader where you never know what's going to happen when you turn the page, to come across some of these things might be quite triggering. Um, but I guess the other question you were asking is, you know, what are the social and biological determinants? Um, let's start with the social ones because it turns out, and I found this a really compelling statistic, that 80% of people with borderline personality disorder experienced neglect or abuse in childhood. So borderline personality disorder, it's not a great label. There's some discussion about whether the name should be changed to emotionally unstable personality disorder. But these are people who, when they're stressed, can feel very threatened and may go on the attack towards others in what they feel is self-defense. So they might shout, they might throw things, they might say terrible things, um, but really just because they're feeling overwhelmed by stress. When they're calm, they can show very good empathy, but under conditions of stress, they might lash out. And, you know, discovering that those individuals themselves experienced neglect or abuse in their childhood gives us a window into the importance of early childhood. You know, that if a child experiences love from a parent or a caregiver and feels valued and loved, the science is telling us that they can grow up being able to love others and care about others' feelings. But in the case of this group of people who clearly didn't receive that birthright, I would say, um, of feeling valued and loved, but instead experience neglect or abuse, that capacity to always keep in mind other people's feelings and thoughts, that can be very fragile. And under, you know, at any point in their later life, under conditions of stress, they might lose that capacity to continuously be aware of other people's thoughts and feelings. So to me, that's a big wake-up call about how we should be teaching new parents about both, you know, what they can give their child positively, but also the dangers of what happens if you shout at your child, if you hit your child, if you abandon your child, or if they feel abandoned. You know, these have kind of long-term effects on child development, and they're all preventable because they're social factors. We can change social factors. So it's just kind of one example, really.
So, in terms of parenting style, I've heard a lot about attachment parenting.
Mm,
Do you
mm.
believe that that's an important, I'm imagining if there's any parents listening right now with wannabe parents, young children, toddlers at home, they want to look at sort of theories of parenting that will actually enable or facilitate that kind of love and tenderness. Is that
Yeah,
something that you would advocate?
Absolutely. I mean, you've used the word attachment, and in that book, Zero Degrees of Empathy or The Science of Evil, I explore the attachment theory developed by John Bowlby. I mean, it goes back to the 1950s. So we've known about this stuff for a long time, that he was showing that if you leave a child developing an insecure attachment, they have long-term difficulties emotionally, including relating to others. Um, so the importance of secure attachment, we need to make sure that it doesn't just stay as theory, that it's somehow implemented. Because, when people go to antenatal classes and they're being taught how to prepare for the birth, that's great, but that's just focusing on, one point in time, and it's mostly focusing on the physical experience of birth and pregnancy. I think we should also be focusing on the emotional dimensions of becoming a new parent or becoming a parent for the second or third time, but just that critical period when your child is so vulnerable to tone of voice, to a parental attention, a sense of being loved, because those are the years when a child learns to trust others and a child learns to regulate their own emotions, and experiences intimacy, which is going to be important right through their lives.
Beautiful. I'm glad I asked that follow-up. I have a couple more questions. And I want to ask just very quickly gender, since you have looked at that, what the difference is in terms of gender and empathy.
Yeah. So my first popular science book was called The Essential Difference, and that referred to gender, because when scientists do research into groups of males and females, there are differences that emerge in terms of empathy. So I mentioned earlier the EQ, the empathy quotient. We've used that instrument in very large populations, 600,000 people, and looked at gender. And consistently, women, on average, score higher than men. We've also used another test called the eyes test, where you just look at people's eyes, showing different facial expressions of emotion. And again, what we find is that women, on average, score higher than men. That's a test of cognitive empathy, just being able to infer from very minimal information around the eyes what someone else's state of mind might be. But, I've used the word on average several times in the last minute or two, because these differences don't apply to all women or all men. When scientists do group comparisons, they're just comparing averages. And it's certainly possible to find men who have high empathy or women who have less, have lower empathy. So it's just about averages. And it led me to look at the biology, actually, of empathy and to look at sex-linked biology like prenatal hormones, such as testosterone and estrogen, both of which are said to masculinize the body and the brain prenatally. And it turns out that when you look at kids who have higher levels of testosterone, for example, in the womb, they have lower scores on the empathy quotient in childhood and later life. So empathy turns out to be a complex mix of social factors, how much love you receive and the stability of your early experience, but also your biology, such as your hormones and genes and neurotransmitters and a lot of the neuroscience we haven't had a chance really to talk about. But it's complex, but I think it's an important area for research.
And as a penultimate question, your appendix has a quiz that people can find out what their empathy quotient is. But appendix 2 is how to spot 0 degrees of empathy, right? Where you're inviting people to say, hey, do you have somebody with borderline personality disorder in your life, or antisocial behavior or conduct disorder? or people recognizing if they are living with a narcissist, for example. What advice do you have for people who are in a relationship, how to protect themselves with somebody who doesn't have a high level of empathy, given those disorders?
No, it was very important. I mean, the first message obviously is you have to look after yourself, whether it's your physical safety or whether it's your emotional well-being, because we're all affected by our environment. And if the person you're living with is not showing you kindness, for example, you need to learn how to put up the boundaries to protect yourself. That might be turning to friends. It might be giving the person feedback. It may be even questioning the relationship itself. Relationships should be mutual and they should be equal. And if you're in a relationship that is neither of those two things, then it could be exploitative, it could be abusive. So it's very important to seek support from people that you feel close to and trust, or, from a professional, to make sure that you're okay.
Thank you for that. One of the questions I love to ask all my guests at the end of the podcast is if they can remember a time when they were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for them. Can you think of anything, Simon?
Right. Of course, I can think of many examples, but I think I'm going to talk a bit about my sister, because my sister was born with quite complex disabilities, physical disabilities, but also learning disabilities. So she had almost no language. She was in a wheelchair. She had epilepsy. We don't know what her developmental level was, but she lived till her 50s. But in some ways had the psychological level of an infant all her life. And towards the end of her life, she ended up in a care home with incredible carers. And so I want to just kind of finish, since you've invited me, to talk about the amazing compassion of people who look after those with disabilities, because they gave her a quality of life, which was very, very, these people are often the lowest paid in society, feeding others, cleaning others, just being in relationship with people with very minimal language and learning disabilities, with huge complex needs. And yet they give themselves so generously. And it is very moving to witness that kind of relationship. So it's kind of a shout out to carers who are helping families as well as the person themselves with disabilities for all the amazing work they do, which is driven by empathy. It's not financially remunerated. It's driven by empathy.
That is a wonderful way to end our conversation, coming full circle to what we began with. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your time, and I'm grateful to everyone who's been listening or watching. I look forward to seeing you.
I want to thank you, Anita, too, for all the amazing work.
Regrettably, the Zoom call cut us off, so I want to thank Simon again for spending an hour with me, and I want to thank you all for listening and watching, and I look forward to seeing you next week at Purposeful Empathy. Thanks so much for watching another episode of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. So now the invitation is to subscribe to the channel and consider picking up a copy of Purposeful Empathy. Thanks again for watching. Have a great day.